Good morning. So glad you guys are here with us. It is an amazing day outside, and we know you could be a million other places. Plus, school started this week, so you probably got a million things going on if you're like me and my family. But we're glad you guys are here with us. If you're watching online, if it's your first time, stop by the Welcome Center. We got a gift for you just for coming here this week, even if we never see you again. A couple of announcements. There's a ton of stuff coming up. I saw on the Journey app, a ton of stuff for kids and stuff as we kind of get back into the swing of things. A couple big announcements for guys. We are having a Forge Nights at the Bats. We got a lot of stuff planned for guys coming up this fall. That is on August 24th. Our good friend here, Sean Bridges, has donated their company suite that night, so we're limited to 30 tickets. There is no cost to go to the game, but we do only have 30 tickets. It's on the app, so if you want to reserve a spot, you need to do that today or tomorrow probably, because those will go fast. You'll need to bring food, money for food and all that stuff, but that's August 24th at 7 o'clock, and so, again, limited to 30 tickets. I'm just going to throw this out there because I love to play, and we need it. If anybody ever wants to play Ultimate Frisbee, there's a group of us that play Ultimate Frisbee on Sundays at 3. If you don't know what Ultimate Frisbee is, you're like most people, but it's a lot of fun, and so we'd love to have you if you're interested in doing that. Like I said, ton of stuff coming up, ways to get connected here at Journey and that. So we are in the third part of this series, and we're kind of talking about time and life and seasons and stories and just kind of how it all intersects. And this year, we opened this series by saying, if you don't know, which you probably do if you've looked at a calendar, this year is almost already over. And so whatever plans maybe you had or ideas for this year, you're a little bit over halfway over this year. Obviously, school's back in session. Today, it feels like fall outside a little bit, which is my favorite season is fall. But don't worry, the state fair is next week, so it'll be hotter than you know what starting next week. And so don't love it too much. But it reminds me, like as we think about this year even, how quick time moves, how fast it moves. And we live in a fast-paced world where time feels like a rare commodity. And if you're anything like me, you find yourself often saying, where did the time go? Right? You know, school's back in season. My daughter plays sports, and so we're starting basketball and soccer again because we're those dumb parents that let them sign up for as many things as they can make. And so we often find ourselves saying, where did the time go? And so it's just one of those things. And part of that is not only asking the question, where did the time go? But it's also the temptation sometimes to put things off until tomorrow. And so we have these ideas of things we'd like to do and accomplish and stuff, and we'll say, well, we'll get to it tomorrow, and then we'll get to it, next month, and then we'll get to it next year. All right? There's so many things, if you're like me, that you said, I'll get to in my later 20s. Remember your early 20s? And so you're like, I'll get to it when, get in my later 20s when I start to feel like an adult. And then you realize that you never actually feel like an adult. And then you get to your 30s and you're like, well, I'm busy right now, so I'll get to it in my 40s. And then next thing you know, life has passed you by, right? And so it's the hard part about time is how quickly it seems to move. And so you put things off, you put things off, you put things off, and then all of a sudden you find yourself in a place where you look back and you don't realize if you have time to do some of the things that maybe you wanted to do. Or maybe you're a planner. Maybe it's one of those things where you are planning things and you're trying things and you're wanting to do things. And then there's the realization that sometimes your plans don't exactly work out the way that you hoped. So we live out by Burnham Forest, and so there are squirrels everywhere. Squirrels are funny creatures, aren't they? And so what I found out years ago, I've reminded you guys of, a comedian tells this joke about it. I won't tell it because I'll butcher it. But essentially in the joke, he talks about this idea that squirrels, when they hide these nuts and things for the winter and all this stuff, around 60 to 80% of the nuts that they hide to get to later, they forget where they're at. Okay, so think about that. You're planning, you're going to all of this, risking death, dancing across the road. Why do squirrels stop in the middle of the road and just stare at you? Do you ever ask that question? And so you're doing all this planning and doing all of this, and then 60 to 80% of the time, all of this planning fails, right? They can't remember, they can't find it. Some other creature gets it, something happens to it. And so maybe it's when you think about time and planning your life out, you feel like a squirrel a little bit. All this planning and running around, making plans, storing and working, stressing and worrying, only to realize it's just not going to work out the way that you hoped, right? And so what happens when you find yourself kind of dealing with those kind of ideas where time just seems to pass by really quickly, Or maybe you had plans or ideas of what life might look like or what your story would look like up to this point. And then we get distracted. Time passes by. Things happen we didn't see coming. The seasons of life move by too fast. Life goes by too fast. And then what do? There's this great verse. It's also kind of depressing. It takes place in James chapter 4. James is the brother of Jesus and one of the early leaders in the church. And he says this. He says, some of you will say, today or tomorrow we will go to the city. So they're going to make these plans. We will stay there a year, do business, and make some money. So they got these great plans for life. And then James, always positive, comes in and says, but you do not know what will happen tomorrow. Your life is like a mist. You can see it for a short time, but then it goes away. So James is reminding us that life is short, as we've been talking about. And so for you guys that don't know what a mist is, I've got my nice little Febreze mister here. And so that's your life. It's a mist. And it smells good for a little bit, okay? But then it just kind of goes away. For you guys that didn't see it on this side, there's your life, okay? Glad you came to church today, aren't you? Okay, so that is us. It's just this quick thing, and then it's gone. And the reality is that we know life goes fast. You don't need me to tell you that. I mean, it's measured in hours and seconds and minutes. But there's also seasons of life. There's Ed, it's kind of my throat a little bit. Hold on. All right. Ebbs and flows, ups and downs. I got to think through that one for second service. All right, ups and downs, and this. All right. Solomon, who's considered one of the wisest men to ever live, but also made a lot of foolish decisions, he reminds us in Ecclesiastes, he says this, there is a time for everything, and everything on earth has its special season. There's a time to be born, and a time to die. There's a time to plant, and a time to pull up plants. There is a time to kill. Please don't kill anybody, though. It's not a good look, okay? And a time to heal. There is a time to destroy and a time to build. There is a time to cry and a time to laugh. There's a time to be sad and a time to dance. There's a time to throw away stones and a time to gather them. There is a time to hug and many more times not to hug, if you ask me, all right? There's a time to look for something and a time to stop looking for things. There's a time to keep things and a time to throw things away. There's a time to tear apart and a time to sew together. There's a time to be silent and a time to speak. There's a time to love and a time to hate. There is a time for war and a time for peace. And so if you follow that kind of poem that Solomon gives us, I mean, he's kind of taken these two extremes. And he says sometimes there's time for this, but then there's also going to be times of this. That's life. Like sometimes it's going well, and then sometimes it's not. Sometimes you're in this season where everything goes well, and he's kind of trying to remind us that there's a reason possibly for every season, and that sounds nice, but what happens when we find ourselves in the seasons or the times or the busyness of life that we don't want to find ourselves in? How do you respond, right? I mean, the reality is that every one of us knows, and we've talked about this many times before, that there are seasons in life, and there are seasons in life that none of us would sign up for. There might be a season of life you find yourself in right now, or a time of life that you find yourself in that you don't want to be in. This is part of it. Sometimes life is exciting, dynamic, and we feel on top of the world. Or sometimes we feel like King David said, oh, that I could fly away with wings like a dove. We find ourselves in something and we want to disappear. We want to hide. We want to get away from it. And so we have to understand that this is life. This is part of it. If we don't understand the seasons of life and understand that there's these ebbs and these flows, and sometimes it goes fast and sometimes it goes slow. But part of what Solomon tells us later in Ecclesiastes, and James reminds us forth into that verse, is that God is with us in that whole process. God has a plan and purpose in life. There's a problem with the process, though. We can't see the scope of it, can we? Sometimes we only see what's right in front of us. We don't see the beginning and the end. We are often very short-sighted. I want to tell us a story today. It's a story that you're probably familiar with, and we're just going to highlight it a little bit, and then we're going to talk through some of the lessons of it. This is a story about a guy that, again, if you've grown up in church, you're very probably familiar with. But it's an interesting story because it's a story of the ebbs and the flows. It's a story of kind of like Solomon talks about, that sometimes there's a season like this and a time like this. And then other times there's a season and a time like this. So in this story, we're introduced to a guy named Joseph. This takes place very, very early on in Scripture in the book of Genesis. And in Joseph's story, if you're familiar with it, it's a pretty fascinating story. So he grows up one of many siblings, one of many brothers, and he's his father's favorite. Okay, and so if you know the story, like there's no and ifs or buts about it. He's his father's favorite. Now, if you were paying attention last week to my sermon that Nathan reminded everybody was incredibly short, it's actually the story of Jacob who becomes Israel. And so this is kind of a continuation of that particular story. Now, he's his father's favorite, and his father gives him gifts, and it's well known that he's his father's favorite. But he's not only been his father's favorite, he's also been given some gifts and abilities by God. And as a reminder, we all have different gifts and abilities. Now, one of his gifts and abilities is that he can have dreams. He can kind of like prophesy about the future, and not only can he prophesy about it, but he can actually interpret it and explain it. And one day, he basically looks at his older brothers, which is a bad idea, and he says, here's what's going to happen one day. I'm going to be really important, and you're all going to bow down to me. Which, if you're a younger sibling, probably not the best move, okay? And so they get angry at him. Eventually, they beat him up, and they sell him into slavery. So Joseph, like at the very beginning of this story, he's about 17 years old when this happens. So he's young, he's stupid. Remember 17, we're all stupid. If you're 17, I apologize, but you're stupid. And so we just are. I was too. All your parents were, all of us. Okay, so he starts off, and it's good. I mean, life is good. And then all of a sudden, he finds himself in a season where it's not good. His brothers have beaten him up, and they actually wanted to kill him at one point, and then they kind of got smarter, and they sell him into slavery. And so this begins his journey into Egypt. Now, when he gets to Egypt, he becomes a servant in a guy named Potiphar's house. And actually, because Joseph is very smart, intelligent, and put together and all these things, he actually does really well in Potiphar's house. He actually becomes the head of the household. In fact, Potiphar leaves him in charge of the entire household and never questions anything. He just lets Joseph kind of run things. And so all of a sudden now it's like this thing that was bad, all of a sudden is looking good again. Because now, like, yeah, it's not ideal, but he's doing well. Like, he's doing okay. And then all of a sudden, because of some accusations and stuff, he finds himself in a bad situation again. He's put in prison. Now, I'm going to go ahead and say this. If any part of your story is a part of your story where you were put in prison, it might not be going so well, right? And so he finds himself in this thing, and you got to remember, like, he thought from early on he's been gifted by God and all of these things. And now, you know, he made his way through his brothers, and now he's got through Potiphar's house, and now he's back in prison. But Joseph, because he's an optimist, and because Joseph always believes that God is with him even in the hard things, he eventually gets to the point where he is actually kind of running the prison. You ever heard this? The inmates are running the asylum? Okay, he's actually kind of running the prison because he's trustworthy and he's doing the right things and all of this stuff. And eventually he almost gets put in charge of the prison. But again, don't forget the part where it's in prison, okay? Like, it's not ideal. And eventually there's these different things that happen, and eventually there's this season where the Pharaoh, who's the most powerful man in the world, he starts to have these dreams, and he's looking for someone to interpret these dreams because these dreams are like haunting him. And all of a sudden there's this reminder of, remember the beginning of the story, that Joseph can interpret dreams. And after a period of time, eventually he gets put in front of Pharaoh, the most powerful man in the entire world at that point in time. And he's able to interpret these dreams and tell Pharaoh, even though everybody else was kind of scared to do this, kind of what these dreams mean. And so Joseph, all of a sudden, he finds himself, he's removed from the prison, and Pharaoh puts him in charge, only second to him, of the entire land. He's put in charge of Egypt. And then at the end of the story, if you know this, part of his prediction was that there was going to be this famine that was going to affect basically everybody in that region in the world. And because of this, Joseph has been given this ability by God. He's able to interpret these dreams. He's able to prepare Egypt for this. And eventually, because it spreads throughout all of the land, eventually, if you know the story, he finds a moment where his brothers, the same brothers that beat him up, threw him in a pit, sold him into slavery, have to come to Joseph in order to get food for their people. And it's like this amazing story, and I love that. And I basically just told you like 6 chapters of the Bible like that. So it's a lot longer, okay? But here's the point, is there's these ebbs and these flows. And what's amazing is this story is that Joseph, and throughout this whole thing, he never forgets. He never allows those individual moments to define him. He never allows those setbacks to bring him down. And I'm sure, that there were moments where he himself even was working through these things and thinking about these things. Now, the other thing about Joseph, and I think we have to remember this as we see stories like this, is to remember it was 17 years old when he started this journey. 17 years old where his brothers beat him up and throw him into this pit. He lived in Egypt for 13 years. So for 13 years between the time of serving Potiphar and his time in prison before he gets before the Pharaoh. And then we're not sure how much time passed between his time in front of the Pharaoh and before the famine actually started. We're not sure. But at least there's another 9 years because there were 7 years of this harvest and then 2 years of this famine. And so there's at least 9 years. So listen, that whole story took about 22 years of his life. 22 years. The reason I tell you that is because that's actually a lot of time. It's a lot of time, a lot of roller coasters of ups and downs for him. It's a lot of seasons. A lot of times of feeling on top of the world, like everything's great. And then a lot of times where you sit there in prison, or you sit there in the bottom of the pit, and you're just wondering, and you're questioning things. And so the reason I want to talk about this is because I want to remind us of a couple things. Because I think when we think about life and we think about how fast it goes and we think about the seasons, and all of us, me included, experience the ups and downs of life, and it's hard sometimes to know what to do with them. And yet you have this story of a guy like Joseph who believed no matter what, in the highs and in the lows, that God was with him. That God could be trusted even in the low points, even in those things. And so when we think about time, here's what I want to remind us of. A couple points when we think about time, we think about our lives, we think about the stuff that we've gone through, the stuff that we will go through, and the stuff that maybe some of us are setting in right now. When we think about how fast it seems to be moving, we think about the ups and the downs and all of that. So the first one is this that I want to remind us of, is this. That no matter what season you might be in, I think they should come up on the screen, maybe. No matter what season you are in, no season lasts forever. Just like here, right? Kentucky's weird, right? I want to say we have 4 seasons, but we have like 45 seasons, don't we? Right? Because it's just constantly changing. And if you're not familiar with Kentucky or this is kind of new to it, you may experience all 4 seasons in the same week sometimes, right? But no season actually lasts forever. And we know this. There's this great line of, "This too shall pass." And so we might find ourselves in kind of this place, or we found ourselves in places. And it's this realization that good seasons come and good seasons go, as do the bad seasons. I often find myself, maybe like some of you guys, when it gets like January, February, I hate the cold, okay? I want it to snow on Christmas Day, that's it, okay? I want it to be cold for like a week and then get bad, go past it. But you got to remind yourself that no season lasts forever. Even when you find yourself in those cold seasons or those hard seasons, to hold on and to believe that spring is coming. That summer will eventually be here, fall will be here. That no season lasts forever. It may be set there for a minute, but no season lasts forever. The second thing is that the change of seasons is normal, right? It just is. I think about the story of Joseph and this idea of like when he's in these like mountaintop experiences and things are going great. And I mean, you got to think that there's like this feeling that like he gets sold into slavery by his brothers, and it's probably a very low point for him. And then he gets to Potiphar's house, and all of a sudden he's back and everything seems to be good. And then he finds himself in prison. And so it's this reminder, just like all of us, that change of seasons is normal. It happens. When bad things happen, it's not a sign that you're a bad person. It's not a sign that God has given up on you. It might just be that bad things are happening. There's this great verse in Genesis 8:22. It says this, "As long as the earth remains, there will be springtime and harvest, winter and summer, day and night." It's just a reminder, like Solomon does, that there's just these times. There's these ups, there's these downs, there's these ebbs, there's these flows to life. So we have to remind ourselves that no season lasts forever, that change of seasons is normal, and that we can't read too much into some of the seasons that we find ourselves in. There's a famous bumper sticker that I can't say out loud, but it starts with S, so I'll change it. This stuff happens, right? It just does. The third thing I think that I pick up from Joseph and reminds me of is the third one. It says this, that we can never let the current season define who we are. I think this is the thing that we sometimes get stuck in. That whatever we're going through right now, we feel like it defines us. We feel like that maybe that's our identity. It's really easy sometimes when you're facing something to allow that to encompass your whole world. To forget the good and the bad, to forget the things you've already come through, the things you've already had to deal with. And so it becomes this part where we become, this is who we are. Sometimes it's hard to see anything past those moments. Identity is the engine that drives relationship. Identity is what drives who we see ourselves as. Identity is how we think that other people see us. And identity sometimes is also the way we see ourselves and how we relate to God. And so if we're in a season or we're in a time period or we're in this thing where it feels like life is broken or life is not going the way that you hoped and you're carrying that with you, it can be hard sometimes to see something else. I love the story of Joseph because we see seasons of prosperity preceded by pits and prisons. The thing is, we understand this, is that good character is often developed not in the high moments, but in the low moments. Character is developed in the pits and the prisons. And what Joseph never forgot is that God is with him, whether you are in a pit, a prison, or a palace. That God was with him in all of those things. Too many of us let things that happen to us or the season we're in define us. Listen, I'm going to go ahead and say this. Sometimes in life, Okay? It sucks. And there are things that happen that shouldn't have happened. And there are things that some of us go through that we wished would never have happened or been a part of our story, but they are. And so we can't allow those moments to define who we are, define the love that God has for you, define your identity. And so never let the current season you're in define who you are. Apologize for saying that word a second ago. Sorry. My mom would be disappointed. All right, so here we go. We've got to learn from every season that you are in. You have to learn from every season that you're in. Every season has lessons of life for us. In Joseph's life, the plan was for him to rule. But Joseph also had to be ruled over before he was ready for that. So sometimes when we go through things, it helps us to become sharper and wiser for the next season. It helps us to kind of get our bearings of things and life. And so we have to try, as hard as it is sometimes, to learn from every season that you're going through. And then the next one is this. We have to learn to keep your mind and heart right. There's this saying I read one time. It says, it's only the water on the inside of the boat that causes danger, not the water on the outside. Right? And so as long as the water stays on the outside of the boat, as scary and treacherous as it may be at times, you're okay. It's when the water starts to come into the boat. And the same could be said of our lives. We're all going to face outside obstacles and challenges. But can we keep our heart and our mind? Can we keep the inside good? Where is your heart during those hard times? Where is your mind? How are you doing? I made the mention last week that some of us go through seasons and things in life where we have to realize, and this is part of our story, we can't carry it on our own. We need help. We need counselors. We need people with wisdom that can speak into our lives. We need to trust that God, even in this thing, that He can see us through it. And so sometimes we have to remind ourselves to keep your heart and mind right, no matter where you find yourself at. As hard as it is to hear sometimes, our hearts are resilient. And it takes time, but our hearts can heal. So we have to prepare them for these things that we're going through. So we have to keep our heart and our minds right, even in the ups and the downs, the ebbs and the flows. I think Joseph, when we think about this, is there's this kind of theme throughout the story, is that he just has this confidence in God. He has this confidence that God's going to see him even through these things. And he never lets those moments define him. And I'm sure the writer of Genesis doesn't give us all the details, but I'm sure there were low moments. I'm sure there were hard moments. But because of Joseph and his character and who he was, he kept his heart and his mind right, even throughout things. And then the last one is this, is to believe that God is at work even in this. Even in whatever it is that you're facing. God was with Joseph in Potiphar's house. God was with Joseph in prison. God was with Joseph when he was put in charge of all of Egypt. God was with Joseph when he had to face his brothers. And he had to choose forgiveness. And so what can you learn in these seasons? Do you believe that God is working? Do you believe that God can work even in this? Now, there's this great question that Jesus asks. And later, much later, past the story of Joseph, he's reminding people when they think about worry and stress in life. Because I realize for some of you, when I talk about how fast life is going, it stresses you out, right? Okay, or we talk about the ups and the downs of life, it stresses you out. Or we talk about like, hey, things might be going great right now, but just wait till next week, It can cause this worry and anxiety. And so Jesus, he's addressing this to these disciples, and he's talking about worry, and he's talking about stress, and he's talking about all the things that can bring us down. And he asks this simple question. He says this. He says, is life not more than? It's a great question because is life not more than, what do you need to fill in the blank with? Is life not more than whatever it is you might be facing right now? Is life not more than this worry you might be carrying or this stress that you might be carrying? Is life not more than that? And for Joseph, this reminder over and over again that life is more than just that circumstance he found himself in. It is. Sometimes we get in a situation where our blinders go on. We forget. Our world shrinks down to that moment, to that thing, to that perseverance, to that thing that we're facing. We have to believe that no matter what season we find ourselves in, good or bad, that God is still good. That God is still in control. That God is bigger than the season that you find yourself in. That God is bigger than the circumstances you find yourself in. And that life is actually more. And so, as we wrap up, so the band, I went 28 minutes just for Nathan, all right, for this week. All right, as we wrap up, here's what I want us to do. I want us to think about a couple things as we go into this time of worship. I just want you to think about where you are. What's going on in your life? What are the pressures? What are the things? What is the water that seems to be trying to come into your boat? And during these next few moments, and it's not going to solve all your problems, I just want you to stop and to reflect. I want us to take this time that we're about to have together of worship just to allow God to speak into your life. To remind us, just like Joseph, that he's still with us, even in this. To believe that he's bigger than whatever we face right now. All right, so let's pray together and let's go into a time of worship. Father God, we love you. We thank you. We thank you for, I thank you for stories like Joseph. A man that went through so many different things, ups and downs, just like all of us in this room go through. And yet throughout this story, whether it was in the good or the bad, whether it was in the passing of time, and God, I think about those moments where he spends in prison, those years that he spends in prison. And yet even in all of that, he believed that you were with him. And God, that life was bigger, that he was bigger, that you were bigger than that circumstance that he faced right there in that moment. And God, my prayer is that for all of us in our hearts and our minds, part of preparing ourselves for things that we face and seasons we go through is just to hold on to that hope, to hold on to the grace and the mercy that you give, to go hold on to this belief that there's just these seasons, there's these times in life. And that God, even though our life is but a mist, God, that you're with us through all of that. So, Father, my prayer is like in these next few moments that regardless, and there's a bunch of us in this room, we probably walked in with a whole bunch of stuff. Some of us right now, we're running Potiphar's house. We're living in the palace. We're having these things. It's a great moment. So just let us reflect on the goodness of who you are, of this season we find ourselves in, this time we find ourselves in. And then maybe for some of us, we feel like we're in the pit, in the prison right now. God, even in that, God, just allow your voice to speak to us, that still small voice to remind us that you're with us, your goodness of your grace, that this moment doesn't have to define us, it doesn't define our identity, and it doesn't define how you feel about us. And so, God, my prayer is in these next few moments that we just have together, that we can connect to you through the words we sing, through this experience we have. So we love you and we thank you. In your Son's name we pray. Amen.